Evil rarely begins with hatred. It begins with certainty. Carl Jung used the term collective shadow to describe what happens when a society refuses to recognize its own capacity for darkness. Qualities that cannot be accepted consciously, aggression, cruelty, envy, resentment, lust for power do not disappear. They accumulate beneath awareness and wait for expression. The collective shadow is not created by monsters. It is created by normal people who believe they are right. Every group forms an identity. In doing so, it defines what it values, what it protects, and what it considers acceptable. At the same time, it defines what it rejects. Whatever does not fit the preferred image of the group is pushed away psychologically. This rejection feels moral. It feels necessary. It feels justified. But psychologically, it is dangerous. What a group cannot tolerate within itself must be located elsewhere. Traits that are denied inwardly are projected outward. Anger becomes the enemy's aggression. Fear becomes the outsider's threat. Cruelty becomes the other side's inhumanity. The group remains innocent. The shadow is carried by someone else. Jung warned that this process intensifies when a society believes itself enlightened, progressive, or morally superior. The more a group insists on its goodness, the more violently it must reject evidence to the contrary. Darkness becomes unthinkable and, therefore, unconscious. Unconscious darkness does not remain passive. It seeks embodiment. History does not repeat because people forget the past. It repeats because the psychological mechanism that produces collective evil remains unexamined. Each generation believes it is different, more advanced, more rational. And each generation produces new enemies onto whom its shadow can be projected. The collective shadow thrives on division. Once a group is split into us and them, moral complexity collapses. The enemy becomes a symbol rather than a human being. Nuance disappears. Violence acquires meaning. This is how ordinary people participate in extraordinary harm, not because they are sadistic, but because they are convinced they are on the right side. Jung insisted that the most dangerous psychological position is not hatred, but righteousness. Hatred at least knows itself. Righteousness feels clean. It anesthetizes conscience. It turns destruction into duty. The collective shadow feeds on fear and belonging. Fear creates urgency. Belonging provides permission. Individuals surrender responsibility to the group and feel relieved doing so. This isn't personal. This is necessary. This is bigger than me. Responsibility dissolves into participation. When the collective shadow takes hold, individuals stop seeing themselves as moral agents. They become functions of a cause, an ideology, or a movement. Actions that would feel intolerable alone feel inevitable together. The shadow is no longer personal. It is shared. And shared shadow is exponentially more destructive than individual darkness. The collective shadow does not announce itself as evil. It announces itself as justice, as protection, as order, as history moving forward. This is why Jung rejected the belief that evil belongs only to certain nations, ideologies, or personalities. The collective shadow is a universal psychological pattern. Any group can fall into it. Any belief system can carry it. Any society can become possessed by it. The question is not whether the collective shadow exists. The question is whether it is recognized. When recognized, it can be limited. When denied, it becomes fate. The collective shadow needs a body. It cannot remain abstract for long. Carl Jung identified scapegoating as the primary mechanism through which a group discharges its denied darkness. When inner tension becomes intolerable, it is redirected toward a person, a class, an ideology, or a symbol that can carry what the group refuses to acknowledge. Scapegoating feels relieving. Anxiety condenses into a target. Confusion becomes clarity. Internal conflict becomes external struggle. The group experiences this as a resolution. Psychologically, it is displacement. Instead of confronting its own contradictions, The group assigns them to another. Aggression is no longer ours, it is theirs. Corruption is no longer internal, it belongs to them. Fear is no longer a weakness, it is a justified response to a threat. The scapegoat must be convincing. They are often different enough to stand out, yet close enough to absorb projection. Minorities, dissenters, outsiders, or symbolic enemies serve this role well. Their complexity is reduced, their humanity is flattened. They become containers rather than people. Jung warned that once a scapegoat is established, moral reasoning collapses. The group no longer asks whether actions are ethical, only whether they are effective. Harm becomes permissible because it is framed as defense, purification, or necessity. This is how cruelty gains moral cover. Scapegoating is rarely spontaneous. It develops gradually through language, imagery, and repetition. Metaphors harden, narratives simplify. The scapegoat is described as dangerous, impure, corrupting, or subversive. These descriptions prepare the psyche for action. By the time violence appears, it feels inevitable. The group believes it is responding, not initiating. Jung emphasized that scapegoating intensifies during periods of instability. Economic pressure, cultural change, identity threat, or loss of meaning increase inner tension. When a society cannot metabolize this tension consciously, it looks for a host. The scapegoat provides a false sense of control. By attacking the external target, the group avoids confronting its own fragmentation. The relief is temporary, but intoxicating. Unity is restored not through integration, but through exclusion. This unity feels powerful. Shared hatred creates cohesion faster than shared values. Jung observed that scapegoating also relieves individual guilt. Actions that would feel immoral alone feel justified in a group. Responsibility diffuses, conscience quiets. The individual tells themselves they are merely participating, not choosing. I didn't decide this. This is what must be done. I'm just following the movement. The scapegoat absorbs the moral burden, but scapegoating never resolves the underlying problem, because the source of tension was internal. Removing the external target does not eliminate it. The group may feel temporarily cleansed, but the shadow remains intact. Soon, a new scapegoat is required. This cycle can repeat indefinitely. Each repetition hardens the psyche, empathy erodes, language becomes absolute, dissent feels dangerous, nuance appears as weakness, the group becomes addicted to certainty and purification. Jung believed this addiction explained why societies often escalate rather than de-escalate conflict. Once the mechanism is active, moderation feels like betrayal. To stop would mean confronting the shadow directly in. That is precisely what the group is avoiding. The scapegoating also distorts perception. Evidence is filtered. Contradictions are ignored. The scapegoat becomes a screen onto which everything negative is projected. Any information that challenges the narrative is dismissed as manipulation or threat. Reality bends to protect the projection. Jung insisted that the most frightening aspect of scapegoating is its sincerity. Those participating often believe they are acting ethically. They feel justified, even virtuous. This sincerity makes the process resistant to correction. Reason cannot penetrate moral possession. Only awareness can. Recognizing scapegoating requires the willingness to ask a dangerous question. What part of ourselves is being avoided by attacking them? This question destabilizes group cohesion. It threatens identity. It invites conflict. That is why it is rarely asked. But without it, the collective shadow grows unchecked. Scapegoating is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of consciousness. And until consciousness expands to include what is denied, the shadow will always find a host. The collective shadow needs a body. It cannot remain abstract for long. Carl Jung identified scapegoating as the primary mechanism through which a group discharges its denied darkness. When inner tension becomes intolerable, it is redirected toward a person, a class, an ideology, or a symbol that can carry what the group refuses to acknowledge. Scapegoating feels relieving, anxiety condenses into a target, confusion becomes clarity, internal conflict becomes external struggle. The group experiences this as resolution. Psychologically, it is displacement. Instead of confronting its own contradictions, the group assigns them to another. Aggression is no longer ours, it is theirs. Corruption is no longer internal, it belongs to them. Fear is no longer a weakness. It is a justified response to a threat. The scapegoat must be convincing. They are often different enough to stand out, yet close enough to absorb projection. Minorities, dissenters, outsiders, or symbolic enemies serve this role well. Their complexity is reduced, their humanity is flattened. They become containers rather than people. Jung warned that once a scapegoat is established, moral reasoning collapses. The group no longer asks whether actions are ethical, only whether they are effective. Harm becomes permissible because it is framed as defense, purification, or necessity. This is how cruelty gains moral cover. Scapegoating is rarely spontaneous. It develops gradually through language, imagery, and repetition. Metaphors harden, narratives simplify. The scapegoat is described as dangerous, impure, corrupting, or subversive. These descriptions prepare the psyche for action. By the time violence appears, it feels inevitable. The group believes it is responding, not initiating. Jung emphasized that scapegoating intensifies during periods of instability. Economic pressure, cultural change, identity threat, or loss of meaning increase inner tension. When a society cannot metabolize this tension consciously, it looks for a host. The scapegoat provides a false sense of control. By attacking the external target, the group avoids confronting its own fragmentation. The relief is temporary, but intoxicating. Unity is restored not through integration, but through exclusion. This unity feels powerful. Shared hatred creates cohesion faster than shared values. Jung observed that scapegoating also relieves individual guilt. Actions that would feel immoral alone feel justified in a group. Responsibility diffuses. Conscience quiets. The individual tells themselves they are merely participating, not choosing. I didn't decide this. This is what must be done. I'm just following the movement. The scapegoat absorbs the moral burden, but scapegoating never resolves the underlying problem, because the source of tension was internal. Removing the external target does not eliminate it. The group may feel temporarily cleansed, but the shadow remains intact. Soon, a new scapegoat is required. This cycle can repeat indefinitely. Each repetition hardens the psyche. Empathy erodes. Language becomes absolute. Dissent feels dangerous. Nuance appears as weakness. The group becomes addicted to certainty and purification. Jung believed this addiction explained why societies often escalate rather than de-escalate conflict. Once the mechanism is active, moderation feels like betrayal. To stop would mean confronting the shadow directly in. That is precisely what the group is avoiding. Scapegoating also distorts perception. Evidence is filtered. Contradictions are ignored. The scapegoat becomes a screen onto which everything negative is projected. Any information that challenges the narrative is dismissed as manipulation or threat. Reality bends to protect the projection. Jung insisted that the most frightening aspect of scapegoating is its sincerity. Those participating often believe they are acting ethically. They feel justified, even virtuous. This sincerity makes the process resistant to correction. Reason cannot penetrate moral possession. Only awareness can. Recognizing scapegoating requires the willingness to ask a dangerous question. What part of ourselves is being avoided by attacking them? This question destabilizes group cohesion. It threatens identity. It invites conflict. That is why it is rarely asked. But without it, the collective shadow grows unchecked. Scapegoating is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of consciousness. And until consciousness expands to include what is denied, the shadow will always find a host. When ideology takes hold, the individual begins to disappear. Carl Jung described this disappearance as one of the most dangerous psychological shifts in collective life. In mass movements, people do not simply think differently, they stop experiencing themselves as responsible agents. The crowd offers relief, relief from doubt, relief from guilt, relief from decision. Within the mass, the individual no longer feels the weight of choice. Actions are no longer owned, they are carried. The group decides, the movement demands, history requires, responsibility dissolves into participation. Jung observed that this dissolution does not require cruelty or fanaticism at the outset. It begins with identification. People identify with a cause, a leader, or a collective narrative that promises meaning and protection. The promise is subtle but powerful. You are no longer alone. Belonging replaces conscience. Once belonging becomes primary, moral judgment shifts outward. Right and wrong are no longer felt internally. They are defined externally by the group's values. The individual measures themselves not by ethical reflection, but by alignment. Am I loyal? Am I consistent? Am I on the right side? These questions replace deeper ones. Mass psychology amplifies emotion and suppresses reflection. Anger feels justified when shared. Fear feels rational when echoed. Doubt feels dangerous when others appear certain. The group rewards conformity with acceptance and punishes deviation with isolation. Isolation is terrifying. Jung emphasized that the fear of exclusion is one of the strongest forces in human psychology. For many, it outweighs ethical hesitation. People participate in actions they would otherwise resist simply to avoid standing alone. This is how responsibility collapses quietly, not through commands, but through atmosphere. Language plays a critical role. In mass movements, language becomes abstract and impersonal. Actions are described as processes, necessities, or inevitabilities. Victims become statistics. Harm becomes policy. Abstraction anesthetizes conscience. When individuals stop encountering the human consequences of their actions directly, empathy fades. The psyche protects itself by numbing. What would once have felt unbearable becomes tolerable. Jung warned that this numbing is contagious. As responsibility diffuses, the threshold for cruelty lowers. Each individual contributes a small amount of indifference, aggression, or compliance. Together, these fragments create a system capable of immense destruction without requiring anyone to feel personally cruel. The system becomes the actor, individuals become functions. This transformation explains why people later claim they were just following orders or caught up in events. Psychologically, this is often true. Consciousness has narrowed. Reflection has been replaced by momentum. Momentum feels unstoppable. Once mass psychology dominates, stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. To question the movement is to risk exclusion, condemnation, or becoming the next target. Silence becomes self-protection. Compliance becomes survival. Jung believed that mass psychology represents a regression, not to primitiveness, but to pre-individual consciousness, a state in which personal responsibility has not yet differentiated from collective identity. The ego is absorbed back into the group. This regression feels powerful. Individuals experience themselves as part of something larger, stronger, and more certain than themselves. Personal doubts disappear. Inner conflict quiets. The cost is invisible at first, but it is real. When the individual dissolves, ethical restraint weakens. The group's goals override personal limits. Violence becomes thinkable. Dehumanization becomes normal. The shadow moves freely. Jung insisted that no system, ideology, or cause absolves the individual of responsibility. Even under extreme pressure, the psyche retains the capacity for choice. Though that capacity may be deeply suppressed, suppressing it does not eliminate it. It creates guilt that may surface later as trauma, depression, or despair. Many people carry the psychological consequences of mass participation long after the movement has ended. History records, events, the psyche records, complicity. Jung believed the only real defense against mass psychology was individuation, the capacity to remain a person within the group. This does not mean withdrawal or apathy. It means maintaining inner dialogue even when outer pressure is intense. The individuated person can participate without dissolving. They can belong without surrendering conscience. They can act without abandoning responsibility. This capacity is rare because it requires enduring loneliness, doubt, and tension. But without it, the collective shadow accelerates unchecked. Mass psychology does not create evil. It removes the barriers that normally restrain it. Fear is the accelerant of the collective shadow. On its own, fear is a biological signal. It alerts, prepares, and protects. But when fear becomes chronic and collective, it changes character. It no longer responds to specific threats. It searches for meaning. Carl Jung observed that societies under sustained fear rarely remain psychologically stable. Economic uncertainty, cultural change, loss of identity, rapid technological shifts, these conditions erode inner orientation. When people no longer know who they are or where they are going, fear intensifies. Fear demands resolution. If fear cannot be understood, it must be directed. This is where moral panic emerges. Moral panic transforms diffuse anxiety into a clear narrative. Something is wrong. Someone is responsible. Action is required. Complexity collapses into urgency. Nuance becomes delay. Reflection becomes danger. The psyche experiences relief. Fear is no longer formless. It has a cause. Jung understood moral panic as a collective defense mechanism. Instead of confronting uncertainty, the group identifies a contaminant influence, group, idea, or behavior believed to threaten order. This contaminant becomes the focus of emotional discharge. The enemy must be visible. Invisible problems are intolerable. Structural issues, internal contradictions, and existential uncertainty offer no target. The psyche prefers a face, a name, a symbol. Fear becomes righteous when framed as protection. We are defending what matters. We are preventing collapse. We must act before it's too late. Urgency silences doubt. Jung warned that moral panic creates an atmosphere in which extreme measures feel reasonable. Once fear is moralized, restraint feels irresponsible. Those who hesitate are accused of naivety, complicity, or betrayal. The collective shadow thrives here. Fear lowers ethical thresholds. Actions once considered unacceptable become thinkable, then permissible, then necessary. Language shifts accordingly. Harsh measures are renamed safeguards. Exclusion becomes protection. Control becomes care. Fear also distorts perception. Threats are exaggerated. Exceptions are treated as proof. Anecdotes replace evidence. Contradictions are dismissed as manipulation. The psyche prioritizes emotional coherence over factual accuracy. Jung emphasized that this distortion is not conscious deception. It is psychological narrowing. Under fear, consciousness contracts. Attention fixes on danger. Everything else fades. This narrowing makes enemies feel everywhere. The group becomes hypervigilant. Neutral behavior is interpreted as hostile. Difference becomes suspicious. Silence becomes guilt. Fear creates an environment where projection spreads rapidly. Each new accusation confirms the narrative. Moral panic also strengthens group cohesion. Shared fear unites faster than shared purpose. People bond through alarm, outrage, and vigilance. The group feels alive, mobilized, necessary. Fear provides meaning when meaning is otherwise absent. Jung believed this was one of the most dangerous substitutions for genuine meaning. Fear-based meaning requires constant renewal. The panic must continue. The threat must escalate. Calm becomes suspicious. resolution feels empty. Once a society organizes itself around fear, peace feels like loss of purpose. This creates a paradox. The group claims to want safety, but psychologically depends on danger. The enemy becomes essential. Without it, the fear would turn inward. That is precisely what the collective shadow avoids. Fear directed outward protects the group from self-examination. Jung warned that moral panic also suppresses empathy. When fear dominates, understanding the other side feels unsafe. Empathy is reframed as weakness. Compassion becomes complicity. The psyche protects itself by hardening. This hardening has long-term consequences. Over time, fear erodes trust, flexibility, and moral sensitivity. The group becomes brittle. Small challengers provoke extreme reactions. Dissent feels existential. The shadow gains momentum. Jung believed that societies trapped in moral panic often mistake intensity for truth. The stronger the emotion, the more justified the belief feels. Calm reflection appears detached, even immoral. But intensity is not clarity. It is compression. The antidote to fear-driven shadow is not reassurance. It is containment. Fear must be held, not discharged. Anxiety must be tolerated long enough to be understood. This requires leadership, dialogue, and psychological maturity qualities that are scarce under pressure. At the individual level, resisting moral panic requires courage. Courage to slow down when others accelerate. Courage to ask what fear is hiding. Courage to recognize how easily one's own anxiety seeks an enemy. Jung believed that fear becomes destructive only when it is denied or exploited. When acknowledged consciously, it can inform without possessing. But when fear governs a group unconsciously, the collective shadow finds everything it needs: an enemy, a justification, a mission, and once fear and righteousness combine, history shows how quickly restraint disappears. Once fear hardens into certainty, escalation begins. Not suddenly, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. Carl Jung emphasized that collective violence rarely starts with an intention to destroy. It begins with justified measures that slowly expand. Each step feels reasonable in isolation. Together, they create a momentum that feels impossible to stop. Escalation follows a psychological logic. First, boundaries shift. What was once unthinkable becomes discussable. What was once unacceptable becomes debatable. What was once debated becomes necessary. The group adapts quickly. Jung noted that humans have an extraordinary capacity to normalize harm when it is framed as protection or prevention. Small acts of exclusion prepare the psyche for larger ones. Language softens reality. Terms like security, order, stability, or progress replace concrete descriptions of suffering. Violence rarely announces itself as violence. It appears as enforcement. Escalation also feeds on retaliation. Each action invites a response. Each response is interpreted as confirmation of threat. The cycle tightens. Restraint feels naive. Moderation appears dangerous. The group tells itself, if we don't act now, it will be worse later. This belief is psychologically powerful. It transforms aggression into foresight. It reframes cruelty as responsibility. The future is used to justify the present. Jung observed that once escalation begins, de-escalation feels immoral. To stop is to admit doubt. To pause is to risk appearing weak. Leaders and followers alike become trapped by the logic they helped create. The collective shadow thrives on this trap. As actions intensify, so does identification with the cause. Individuals invest their self-image in the movement. Admitting error would threaten not only beliefs, but identity. The psyche protects itself by doubling down. Each step forward burns the bridge behind. Jung warned that escalation often coincides with a narrowing of consciousness. Alternatives disappear. Only two options remain: victory or annihilation. Complexity collapses into survival logic. This narrowing is dangerous. It eliminates imagination. Without imagination, the psyche cannot conceive of outcomes other than domination or destruction. Compromise feels like surrender. Dialogue feels like delay. Peace feels unreal. Violence becomes the only language left. Escalation also redistributes responsibility. As actions intensify, individuals feel less responsible for the consequences. Decisions appear systemic rather than personal. The phrase "there was no choice" becomes common not as excuse, but as genuine experience. Psychologically, this is a form of possession. The individual no longer experiences agency, they experience necessity. Jung believed this was one of the most terrifying aspects of collective evil. People act without feeling they are acting. The shadow has taken over the sense of will. Escalation is reinforced by reward. Those who act decisively are praised. Those who hesitate are marginalized. Aggression is interpreted as courage. Caution is framed as weakness. The group selects for intensity. This selection accelerates the process. More extreme voices gain influence. More moderate ones fall silent. The emotional center of gravity shifts toward confrontation. What once felt radical now feels normal. Jung observed that escalation often produces a strange emotional state, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The movement feels alive. People feel significant. Personal emptiness is replaced by collective purpose. This is intoxicating. It binds individuals to the cause even as it consumes them. But escalation cannot stabilize. The psyche cannot sustain constant intensity. Eventually, violence exceeds justification. Atrocities accumulate. The gap between narrative and reality widens. Denial intensifies. At this point, collapse or catastrophe becomes likely. Jung insisted that escalation ends only when reality reasserts itself through exhaustion, defeat, or internal fracture. The psyche cannot indefinitely suppress what it knows. When collapse comes, it is often sudden. Certainty evaporates. Justifications feel hollow. Individuals confront actions they no longer recognize as their own. Guilt emerges sometimes immediately, sometimes years later. The shadow recedes, but it leaves damage. Jung believed that the aftermath of escalation is psychologically as dangerous as escalation itself. Shame, trauma, and denial compete. Some individuals reflect, others rewrite history. Many dissociate. The collective shadow does not disappear. It retreats, and unless it is consciously integrated, it waits. Escalation feels inevitable only while consciousness is narrow. When awareness expands, when individuals recognize the psychological mechanisms at work, the sense of inevitability weakens. Choice reappears. Responsibility returns. This recognition does not undo harm, but it prevents repetition. Jung believed that understanding escalation psychologically was essential not only for historical analysis, but for prevention. Without such understanding, societies remain vulnerable to the same pattern again and again each time convinced it is different. The collective shadow does not remain abstract. It seeks a face. Carl Jung observed that during periods of collective tension, societies instinctively look for figures and symbols that can carry what they cannot consciously hold. Leaders, icons, flags, slogans, and myths become psychological vessels. Through them, the shadow becomes visible, speakable, and actionable. This process is not necessarily deliberate. Often, leaders do not create the shadow, they attract it. A leader rises at the precise moment when collective emotions need expression. They articulate what others feel but cannot admit. They simplify what feels overwhelming. They offer certainty where doubt has become unbearable. The leader becomes a mirror, not of the group's highest ideals, but of its unconscious needs. Jung emphasized that charismatic authority is rarely about intelligence or strategy alone. It is psychological resonance. The leader embodies something the group longs for: strength, purity, decisiveness, revenge, redemption, or unity. In doing so, they become a symbolic container. The shadow flows into them. Once this happens, the leader is no longer experienced as an individual. They become a figure. Criticism feels like attack. Questioning feels like betrayal. Loyalty becomes moral rather than practical. The leader is idealized, and what is idealized cannot be questioned. Jung warned that idealization is the gateway to possession. When a group invests its shadow into a leader, it also surrenders responsibility. Decisions are no longer weighed ethically. They are justified by alignment. If they say it, it must be right. If they lead us, they know. Symbols intensify this process. Flags, slogans, uniforms, images, and rituals condense complex emotions into simple forms. They bypass reflection and speak directly to feeling. A symbol does not argue. It evokes. Jung understood symbols as powerful psychological shortcuts. They compress meaning. They unite individuals emotionally. They create instant belonging. But they also bypass conscience. When symbols are charged with shadow, they become dangerous. They turn aggression into identity. Violence becomes expression rather than choice. Destroying the enemy feels like affirming the symbol. This is how destruction acquires meaning. The leader and the symbol reinforce each other. The leader embodies the symbol. The symbol legitimizes the leader. Together, they form a closed psychological loop. Within this loop, dissent feels sacrilegious. Jung observed that once a leader is psychologically fused with a symbol, reality becomes secondary. Failures are reinterpreted. Contradictions are ignored. Harm is reframed as necessity. The symbol must be protected at all costs. At this stage, the leader may begin to believe their own image. Possession is not limited to followers. Leaders themselves become trapped by the role they are expected to play. They must appear decisive even when uncertain. They must escalate to maintain authority. They cannot retreat without shattering the projection. Jung believed many leaders are eventually destroyed by the shadow they carry. The role consumes the person. What began as resonance becomes imprisonment. The leader loses inner dialogue. Doubt disappears. Empathy narrows. The symbol demands consistency, not reflection. Any deviation feels like collapse. This is why Jung insisted that leadership without psychological awareness is inherently dangerous. Without differentiation between person and projection, the leader becomes an instrument of forces they do not control. The group, meanwhile, experiences relief. Responsibility has a face now. If something goes wrong, blame can be redirected. If something succeeds, the symbol is confirmed. The group no longer has to confront its own contradictions. The leader carries them. This arrangement is seductive, but it is unstable. When the leader fails or reality intrudes, the projection fractures. Disillusionment sets in. The group experiences shock, rage, or denial. Some cling harder to the symbol. Others turn violently against it. The shadow shifts hosts. Jung noted that societies often swing between idealization and demonization. The same figure who was once savior becomes traitor. The underlying psychology remains the same. The refusal to own the shadow personally. Symbols, too, lose power when they no longer contain emotion. They must be replaced. New slogans emerge. New enemies are named. The cycle repeats. Jung believed the only way to interrupt this cycle was symbolic consciousness. Symbols must be recognized as symbols. Leaders must be seen as individuals. Meaning must be held without projection. This requires psychological maturity at both the individual and collective level, a capacity to tolerate uncertainty, imperfection, and inner conflict without displacing them onto figures of authority. Without this maturity, societies will continue to externalize their shadow into leaders and symbols, mistaking possession for unity. The face of the shadow is never the real problem. It is the mirror. Modern societies often believe they have outgrown the dangers Jung described. They have not. They have reconfigured them. Carl Jung would have recognized contemporary polarization immediately not as a political phenomenon, but as a psychological one. Polarization is what happens when the collective shadow splits reality into opposing moral camps and refuses integration. The structure is familiar. Each side experiences itself as rational, ethical, and necessary. Each side views the other as dangerous, ignorant, or corrupt. Dialogue collapses because listening feels like contamination. Complexity feels like compromise. The psyche seeks clarity. Polarization provides it. When a society becomes polarized, internal conflict is exported outward. Ambivalence becomes weakness. Nuance becomes betrayal. The individual no longer asks whether something is true, but whether it aligns with the group's identity. Identity replaces understanding. Jung warned that once identity fuses with ideology, the shadow gains leverage. Criticism is no longer evaluated, it is rejected. Evidence is no longer weighed, it is interpreted. Information becomes ammunition rather than insight. This is not deception. It is psychological narrowing. Polarization simplifies the world into moral binaries that feel emotionally satisfying. Good and evil are clearly assigned. Anxiety decreases because uncertainty is reduced. Belonging intensifies because opposition sharpens group boundaries. The cost is consciousness. In polarized environments, individuals stop relating to others as people. They relate to them as positions. Human complexity disappears behind labels. Once this happens, empathy becomes nearly impossible. Jung emphasized that the shadow always appears in exaggerated form. The enemy is not merely wrong, they are malicious. They are not mistaken, they are dangerous. The more extreme the projection, the more unconscious it is. Polarization thrives on this exaggeration. Social structures amplify it. Algorithms reward outrage. Media favors conflict. Language becomes performative rather than reflective. Emotional intensity becomes a measure of conviction. Those who speak calmly appear uncommitted. Those who hesitate appear suspect. Polarization, pernicious ambivalence. Jung believed this punishment was psychologically significant. Ambivalence is the ego's signal that something complex is being encountered. When ambivalence is suppressed, the psyche compensates with rigidity. Rigidity feels strong, but it is brittle. In polarized systems, individuals often experience a strange internal split. Outwardly, they express certainty. Inwardly, doubt persists. This dissonance is resolved not by reflection, but by doubling down. The louder the certainty, the more anxiety it conceals. The collective shadow feeds on this tension. Each side accuses the other of being possessed by ideology, by ignorance, by malice fit, without recognizing its own possession. The accusation becomes proof of innocence. If they are extreme, we must be right. Jung warned that this dynamic produces a self-reinforcing loop. The more polarized a society becomes, the harder it is to imagine alternatives. Middle ground disappears. Compromise feels immoral. Victory becomes the only acceptable outcome. This logic escalates conflict. Polarization also creates moral shortcuts. Actions are judged not by their consequences, but by who performs them. The same behavior is condemned or justified depending on alignment. Ethics become conditional. This conditionality erodes trust. Once trust collapses, fear increases. Fear intensifies projection. Projection deepens polarization. The cycle accelerates. Jung believed that modern societies are particularly vulnerable to this process because traditional contained religion, shared myth, communal ritual have weakened. Without shared symbolic frameworks, conflict moves directly into identity. Identity becomes sacred, and whatever threatens the sacred must be eliminated. Polarization is therefore not merely disagreement. It is sacralized opposition. Opponents are not just wrong, they are existential threats. Their existence destabilizes meaning. This is why compromise feels impossible. It would require surrendering a piece of identity. Jung insisted that breaking polarization does not begin with persuasion. It begins with shadow recognition. The moment an individual recognizes that the intensity of their reaction may say more about what is unacknowledged within themselves than about the other side, polarization loosens slightly. This recognition is destabilizing. It costs belonging, it risks isolation, but it restores agency. Jung believed individuation was the only psychological counterforce strong enough to resist polarization. Individuation does not mean neutrality or withdrawal. It means maintaining in a dialogue, even while participating in collective life. The individuated person can hold opposing values without collapsing. They can recognize truth on multiple sides without fusing identity to any single one. They can act ethically without requiring absolute certainty. This position is uncomfortable. It offers no applause, but it preserves consciousness. Polarization thrives where inner conflict is denied. It weakens where inner conflict is tolerated. The collective shadow loses power when individuals refuse to export what they cannot accept within themselves. Modern polarization is not a failure of information. It is a failure of psychological integration. Until societies learn to recognize their own shadow in the face of the other, polarization will continue to intensify, each side convinced it is fighting darkness while unknowingly feeding it. The collective shadow cannot be eliminated, it can only be integrated. Carl Jung was clear on this point. Every attempt to destroy the shadow strengthens it. Suppression does not remove darkness. It drives it underground, where it becomes more dangerous, more distorted, and more explosive. Integration begins with a reversal of direction. Instead of asking who is responsible out there, the individual must ask what in me is reacting so strongly. This question does not deny real injustice or harm. It challenges the assumption that all darkness belongs elsewhere. This challenge is destabilizing. The ego prefers clarity and innocence. Shadow recognition threatens both. It reveals that aggression, envy, desire for domination, and moral blindness are not foreign intrusions. They are human potentions, including one's own. Jung emphasized that integration does not mean acting out shadow impulses. It means owning them psychologically so they no longer require projection. What is recognized consciously loses its compulsive force. This principle applies collectively as well as individually. A society that acknowledges its capacity for violence becomes more restrained, not less. Awareness introduces hesitation. Hesitation introduces ethics. Ethics introduce limits. Denial removes limits. Collective integration requires creating spaces where contradiction can be held without immediate resolution. This is difficult in cultures that reward certainty, speed, and emotional intensity. Integration is slow. It requires patience and tolerance for discomfort. Most societies resist this. It is easier to accuse than to reflect. Easier to mobilize than to pause. Easier to divide than to integrate. Jung believed that genuine integration begins at the individual level. Groups do not become conscious. Individuals do. When enough individuals resist projection, the collective dynamic weakens. This resistance is quiet. It does not announce itself as virtue. It does not demand recognition. It often appears as hesitation, nuance, or refusal to simplify. These qualities are easily misunderstood. In polarized environments, integration can look like betrayal. Those who question their own side are treated with suspicion. Those who recognize complexity are accused of relativism or cowardice. Jung warned that this reaction is predictable. The shadow defends itself. When integration threatens projection, the collective responds with pressure. Individuals are pushed to choose sides, to declare loyalty, to conform. Remaining psychologically differentiated requires courage. Courage not to be certain. Courage not to belong unconditionally. Courage to endure isolation. Integration also requires language. Shadow material must be named carefully. Moral condemnation shuts dialogue down. Rationalization dissolves responsibility. Integration requires a language that can hold tension without collapse. This language is rare. It avoids absolutes. It acknowledges limits. It admits uncertainty. Such language feels weak in a culture addicted to strength, but it is psychologically strong. Jung believed that integration also demands memory. Societies must remember not only what was done to them, but what they have done. Selective memory sustains innocence. Honest memory introduces humility. Humility weakens the shadow, not by erasing it, but by removing its moral armor. When a group admits its own capacity for harm, it becomes less susceptible to moral panic. Fear loses urgency. Enemies lose symbolic necessity. The drive toward purification slows. This does not create utopia. It creates restraint. Integration does not promise harmony. It promises containment. Containment allows conflict without destruction. It allows disagreement without dehumanization. It allows fear without panic. Jung believed that the greatest danger of the modern world was not ignorance or evil intent, but unconsciousness. Unconscious forces act with absolute certainty. Conscious forces hesitate. Hesitation is not weakness. It is a space where responsibility re-enters. Integration also changes how power is experienced. Power is no longer seen as something possessed by the other side. It is recognized as a human temptation. This recognition introduces checks internally and externally. The integrated individual does not seek purity. They seek proportion. They do not need enemies to define themselves. They do not require absolute righteousness to act ethically. They recognize that every position contains shadow, including their own. This recognition does not paralyze action. It disciplines it. Jung believed that collective shadow integration would always be incomplete. The shadow cannot be finished. It can only be related to consciously. Each generation must do this work anew. There is no final victory, only vigilance. Integration is not dramatic. It does not trend. It does not mobilize crowds, but it prevents catastrophe. When individuals refuse to export their darkness, the collective shadow loses fuel. When projection weakens, escalation slows. When escalation slows, violence becomes less inevitable. This is how integration works. Quietly, imperfectly, one psyche at a time. Say next when you're ready to continue with Block 10, where we explore individuation as the only lasting defense against the collective shadow. Next, Block 10, individuation as defense against the collective shadow. The collective shadow gains power where individuality collapses. Its most reliable antidote is individuation. Carl Jung did not present individuation as a path of self-improvement or personal fulfillment. He understood it as a psychological necessity, the process by which a person becomes capable of carrying inner conflict without exporting it into the world. Individuation does not remove the individual from society. It makes participation conscious. At its core, individuation is the capacity to distinguish between what belongs to the self and what belongs to the group. Without this distinction, collective emotions pass through the individual unchecked. Fear, rage, and certainty move straight from the crowd into action. The individuated person introduces friction. Friction slows reaction. Slowness restores choice. Jung believed that individuation begins when the ego recognizes its own limits. This recognition is destabilizing. It dismantles fantasies of purity, righteousness, and moral exemption. The individuated person no longer needs to be innocent to act ethically. They accept responsibility for their own shadow. This acceptance is crucial. An individual who has confronted their own aggression is less likely to project it. One who has acknowledged their own desire for power is less likely to surrender it blindly to authority. One who knows their own fear is less likely to demand enemies to contain it. Individuation does not produce certainty. It produces proportion. Proportion allows the individual to see collective narratives without being swallowed by them. Ideologies appear as partial truths rather than total realities. Leaders appear as people rather than symbols. Enemies appear as humans rather than containers. This shift changes everything. The individuated person can still disagree strongly. They can still act decisively. But their action is grounded in responsibility rather than possession. They remain aware of what they do not know, even while choosing. Jung insisted that individuation requires ongoing inner dialogue. Dreams, emotional reactions, moral discomfort, these are signals, not inconveniences. They indicate where unconscious material is pressing for recognition. Ignoring these signals strengthens the shadow. Listening to them weakens it. Individuation is therefore not comfortable. It requires tolerating ambiguity in a culture that demands clarity. It requires enduring doubt when others offer certainty. It requires standing alone when belonging is conditioned on compliance. This loneliness is real. But Jung believed it was preferable to the loneliness that follows mass possession, the loneliness of realizing one's actions no longer align with one's conscience. Individuation also restores ethical imagination. The individual who has differentiated psychologically can imagine alternatives to escalation. They can conceive of restraint without weakness, compromise without betrayal, and boundaries without dehumanization. These capacities disappear in mass psychology. Jung noted that the individuated person often appears strange or unsettling to groups under tension. They do not react as expected. They do not amplify outrage. They do not simplify conflict. This refusal to synchronize emotionally can provoke hostility. The group senses a threat, not because the individuated person is dangerous, but because they disrupt projection. They remind the group of what it is avoiding. This is why individuation is often resisted. It costs belonging, but it preserves agency. Jung believed that no system could protect humanity from its own shadow without individuals capable of inner restraint. Laws, institutions, and norms matter, but they depend on people who can use them without possession. When individuation weakens, systems become weapons. When individuation strengthens, systems become safeguards. Individuation does not eliminate conflict. It prevents totalization. The individuated person knows that no cause contains the whole truth. No enemy contains all evil. No ideology contains final meaning. This knowledge limits how far they are willing to go. Limits are the enemy of the collective shadow. The shadow seeks absolutes. Individuation insists on boundaries. Jung warned that modern societies tend to undervalue individuation because it is invisible. It does not produce slogans. It does not generate crowds. It does not feel heroic, yet it is the only force capable of interrupting collective possession. History is shaped not only by movements, but by individuals who refuse to surrender their inner dialogue. These individuals rarely appear in headlines. Their impact is cumulative rather than dramatic. They slow escalation. They complicate narratives. They reintroduce conscience. Jung believed that the survival of modern societies depended less on correct ideology than on psychological maturity. Without individuation, progress becomes another mask for the shadow. With individuation, even flawed systems can be used responsibly. Individuation does not save the world. It prevents the psyche from destroying it. This prevention is quiet. It happens internally, long before action becomes inevitable. It occurs when an individual pauses, reflects, and chooses not to act out what feels urgent but remains unconscious. That pause is where freedom lives, and where the collective shadow begins to lose its grip. Say next, when you're ready to conclude with Block 11, approximately 500 words, where we bring the entire video together and explore what responsibility looks like in a world that cannot eliminate its shadow, but can learn to live with it consciously. Next, Block 11, responsibility in a world that cannot eliminate its shadow. The collective shadow cannot be defeated. There is no final victory, no permanent solution, no moment after which humanity is safe from itself. Carl Jung understood this with unsettling clarity. He did not believe the problem of evil could be solved through better systems, correct ideologies, or moral progress alone. The shadow is not a historical error. It is a permanent psychological reality. What can change is how it is carried. The most dangerous illusion is the belief that darkness belongs elsewhere, another nation, another group, another era, another kind of person. This belief creates innocence, and innocence invites possession. When people are certain they are incapable of evil, they become its most efficient instruments. Responsibility begins where innocence ends. To live responsibly in a world with a collective shadow means accepting a difficult truth. Every human being contains the same psychological potentials that produce cruelty, hatred, and destruction. Circumstances may differ. Expressions may vary. But the capacity is universal. This recognition does not lead to despair. It leads to restraint. When individuals know what they are capable of, they hesitate. They reflect. They resist urgency. They question narratives that promise purity, redemption, or absolute righteousness. They become harder to mobilize blindly. This hesitation is not weakness. It is conscience. Jung believed that responsibility is not primarily political or moral. It is psychological. It begins with inner awareness of fear, resentment, aggression, envy, and the desire for certainty. These forces do not disappear when ignored. They become dangerous when denied. Responsibility means holding these forces consciously rather than exporting them. This holding is uncomfortable. It requires living without guarantees. It requires accepting that no ideology will absolve one from ethical ambiguity. It requires tolerating guilt, doubt, and inner conflict without rushing toward external enemies for relief. Most people avoid this burden. It is easier to belong than to individuate. Easier to follow than to choose. Easier to condemn than to reflect. The collective shadow thrives where responsibility feels unbearable. But Jung insisted that responsibility is not optional. When individuals refuse it, groups absorb it, and groups, unlike individuals, do not feel remorse. They feel momentum. Responsibility returns only when individuals reclaim their capacity to pause, to think, and to say, no, even quietly, even privately. Not every refusal is dramatic. Often it appears as non-participation, silence, or refusal to amplify fear. These acts rarely receive recognition, but they matter. Jung believed that history is shaped not only by those who act, but by those who restrain action. The absence of escalation is invisible, yet decisive. Many catastrophes never occur because someone chose not to continue. Responsibility also requires memory. Societies must remember not only their suffering, but their participation in harm. Memory without reflection hardens into grievance. Reflection without memory dissolves into abstraction. Both are necessary to prevent repetition. Jung warned that forgetting the shadow does not make societies innocent. It makes them vulnerable. To live responsibly with the collective shadow is to abandon fantasies of moral purity and embrace psychological maturity. This maturity does not promise harmony. It offers proportion. It does not eliminate conflict. It limits destruction. Responsibility means acting while knowing one may be wrong. It means choosing without certainty. It means recognizing one's own capacity for harm and therefore refusing to surrender judgment to crowds, symbols, or leaders. This stance is lonely, but it is stabilizing. Jung believed that the future of humanity depended less on changing the world than on changing how individuals relate to their own darkness. Without this change, every new system becomes another mask. With it, even imperfect systems can be used with restraint. The collective shadow will always exist. What matters is whether it is owned consciously or acted out blindly. Responsibility is the difference. It does not save humanity. It prevents it from losing itself.